You might want to sit down for this. Canada's highest paid CEOs made more than the average Canadian before lunch today. According to a new report by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, the average compensation for Canada's top bosses hit a record, $10.4 million in 2016. That's more than 200 times the average worker's salary of just under $50,000. CEO pay packages rose 8% from 2015, while an average worker's salary rose by just 0.5%. But is this an equal comparison and the right way to measure inequality? Peter Bleyer is the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and he joins us now from Ottawa to answer just that. So is it fair, Peter, to make this type of comparison?
Absolutely. It's not the only way to measure inequality, but across the globe, this is viewed, executive pay and the gap between executive pay and average worker pay is viewed as a proxy, as an indicator of inequality, and in this case, dramatically growing inequality. Let's remember that 20 years ago, we were looking at a ratio that was more like 100 to 1, and studies have shown that in the U.S., Ronald Reagan's U.S. of the 1980s, we're looking at a ratio of 50 to 1. And we also know that many of folks who have been engaged in developing corporate governance expertise as well as management expertise have long argued that ratios more in the 20 or 25 to 1 range were more appropriate for a whole bunch of reasons. So it's about inequality, most certainly, but it's also about where's our economy going and what kind of signals is it sending, and are these danger signals about where we're headed? Are we headed back to pre-2008 context, where, for example, the fact that executive compensation is so tightly tied to share value is leading to the kind of decision-making in C-suites that may not be best for those corporations, let alone for the economy and long-term growth in the economy.
Right, but now on that point of share value, I mean, that's why, in part, it seems these salaries are growing. You're saying, you know, they're growing more than ever type of thing. Is that not because the stock market did so very well last year? You know, TSX up 18%. And I'm looking at the top guy on the list from Valiant. Yep. His salary was $83 million. Well, 56 of that came from stock. So is that really the biggest issue here?
I think it's a huge issue. And the reason it's a huge issue is that, again, what we're doing is we're tying executive decision-making to short-term stock value. And in terms of inequality, let's remember that, you know, it's time to ask the question yet again, is it really fair that unearned income is taxed at half the rate of earned income? Because that's the story here. That is one of the key parts of this story. These CEOs have the ability and have the support networks that allow them to structure compensation in a way that essentially they pay less taxes than the average Canadian worker does. Now, is that fair? If we don't have comprehensive tax reform, we're never going to fix this. For some, this isn't a problem, but frankly, even in the corporate world, I think there are a lot of folks who believe that this galloping runaway corporate compensation, A, and B, compensation that's so closely tied to short-term value and to fluctuations in the market and so forth, rather than, you know, to trading value as opposed to building value, as I think Roger Martin said, those kinds of attitudes are quite widespread. So we really need somebody to put their foot down, collective foot down perhaps, both in terms of taxation, but also looking at the corporate world and saying, for example, why not have annual meetings, set an annual cap on executive compensation? At least these issues would get discussed at those meetings in a way that often they are not.
Can you give me a quick answer, Peter, because we've only got about 30 seconds left, on how can we get more people to be investing? Like, this is the other issue, is that CEOs have done well with stock. So have all the people with RSPs and mutual funds and all the rest of it. Some might say they even owe it to the CEOs who have done well. But in any case, there's a lot of people in Canada who aren't saving anything, are not in the market. How could that be addressed?
Correct. Well, that's why, I mean, one of the issues here is that we have a lot of these corporations that are paying these top CEOs at these crazy rates who aren't even, who have huge deficits in their employee pension plans. Let's look at all the other mechanisms we have to support people in retirement, as opposed to assuming that the stock market and essentially what ends up sometimes, because of some of the ways in which executive compensation is structured, as one example, ends up being more of a game than actually an attempt to build real value for the long term.
Right. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Peter Bleyer is the Executive Director at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives.